your 11th lecture online, and the topic is translation and cultural issues. So it's more or less close to what we finished, where we finished the last class. If you remember, that was discussion of Vinuti's work. Remember that lecture number 10 था Vinuti's work में जो आप discussion कर रहे थे. So that was also, although Vinuti in particular was also talking about in terms of the Anglo-American policy, that their work in terms of making or forcing the translator in terms of that looking at this at the target culture, and in terms of doing the translation which kind of suits the target culture. Here, in this particular topic, translation and cultural issues, uh, is basically in terms of, we are going to specifically talks about that how this new approach, should I say, to translation studies emerged. So all these trends, as they're emerging, they do have a connection with each other, one leading to another. Okay, here it is in terms of this particular issue in which the focus is on translation, on culture, that how important is the culture when the translator is translating into the target language, how important or significant is the target culture as well in terms of the translation, the translator has to keep in mind that factor. Okay, so let's look, when we talk about translation and cultural issues, a very, very important term, a key term, should I say, is the word, the cultural turn. What is it called? The cultural turn. So the cultural turn is a term, uh, somebody wants to join, is a term which is used in translation studies for the move towards analysis of translation from a cultural studies. So this particular term, cultural turn, जिसको कह रहे हैं, it's a particular term, a key term in translation studies. Some because some it was in terms of talking about that how the analysis of translation moved on in terms of basically from a very, very cultural studies angle, that the focus of and the focus obviously is all on the target culture in which it has to be translated. So in this case, the role of two or three theorists is very important. I'm sorry, this is a misprint. It is not Susan, it is Susan, Susan. There's a misprint here. It is Susan Besnert and Andrea Lefevere, in together in their publication, in their essays, which they is titled a translation, history, and culture. They dismiss the earlier linguistic theories of translation and the painstaking comparisons between original and translation, which do not consider the text in its cultural environment. So, what it means that for these two prominent theorists, Susan Besnett and Andrea Lefevere, when they were writing this particular book, in which it's basically a collection of essays by both these two theorists, the role of history and culture, and they're all interrelated in terms of translation. So, history of, in terms of a text which is to be translated, what is it's based upon, and the culture which is reflected in that. So somehow in this particular approach, these theorists believe that the earlier linguistic type of theories which you have all studied in all word for word, sense for sense translations and other, and which you there was a kind of a very minute, intense comparison between original and translation. If that was the main aim of the translator, that how close the translation should be in terms of in terms of syntax, in terms of, should I say, linguistic aspects like the syntax and language and vocabulary and others. But here, this approach it was shifted by Susan Besnett and Andrea Referé, when they said that what is of immense importance, which is being somehow missed in earlier translations, is the cultural aspect, is the cultural studies angle from which translation should be correct, it should be carried on. So let's see what did they imply by this. So instead, Besnett and Lefevre go beyond language and focus on the interaction between translation and culture. On the way, culture impacts and constraints translation on the larger issues of context, history, and convention. So when these two theorists they talked about this particular approach, which was beyond language and linguistic aspect, and they said what is more important is that when any translation is being conducted, it's very important that culture plays a very prominent role, and it also constrains in terms of larger issues when you talk about in terms of context, history, convention. These things have to be kept in mind as the translator. You have to keep in mind that what is the impact of these when somebody is translating from source text to target, from source language to target language, source text to target text. Okay, so this is important that how these issues are catered to context and history and convention. So this particular move from in translation as a text to translation as a culture and politics is what Mary Snell Hornaby calls in a paper the cultural. She gives it a new term, and she calls it as the cultural term. So actually, this term cultural turn was actually given by Mary Snell Hornaby. It was Mary Snell Hornaby in 1990 who introduced this term cultural turn in her paper. And this was a kind of a move, a very important move in translation studies. How? In terms of that it moved from translation, not specifically that you are translating a text, that is obviously you are translating something. It's an abstract or a prose or a fictional or a non-fictional or a literary or non-literary text, whatever it is. But the focus somehow was that normally in translation so far we have talked about the text as the basic unity, and within that you talk about the syntax, the language, the structure, the words, how do this they stand for, vocabulary, and the content also. But here, according to Mary Hornaby, what is important is that an important thing which has to be which has to be integrated in a translation is the culture and politics of whatever the text comprises of, whatever culture is depicted in the source text, how, when it is translated into the target text, should it be, what should be the approach of a translation? Translator, should it be exactly the same culture of a source text be translated into the target culture, or should be somewhere any other approach? According to Mary Hornaby, she felt and she introduced this term cultural turn. So for her, cultural turn was in fact, it meant was that the first thing, the first priority which a translator should be in terms of depicting or kind of presenting when you are translating the source text to the target text, your main important factor is the culture of the target language, or it should be acceptable in the to the target audience. And how something would be acceptable to the target audiences if the text which is translated it's closer in terms of culture of the target audience, target language, and for the people whom it's being translated. Okay, so the thrust actually moves from not from the literary, the language aspect, word for word translation and all that, and sense for it. ज़्यादा importance किसकी है on the culture that when you present it, when you kind of presenting it in the form of a translation to another language, to the target language, the people who are reading that, it is obviously for their benefit that this book is being translated, say a Spanish book which is being translated into English from South America, Brazilian or South American writers get the books translated Orient to English. Who's the target audience? It's Americans or the people or the Anglo-American audience who are going to read that. So it should be in their in terms of it would be more feasible. It should be appropriate, and it would be like more reader friendly, I should say, if the target culture is kept in mind by the translator and should translate in such a way that they should feel कि ये translation नहीं, ये तो as if it has been written in their own language. English में लिखी गई थी. Everything is the cultural terms and everything is so close to their own culture, target culture. So Besnet and Lefevere take this concept in their case studies in their collection, which includes studies of changing standards in translation over time. So these two theorists, Besnet and Lefevere, which I've mentioned about their key work, जिसमें उनकी collection of essays and translation history and culture. So what they have done in this book is that they have also brought about case studies. Case studies means they've taken up real life translations from source language and how they're translated into target language, and they have come up with these case studies and presented them in this book in terms of telling, in sense of guiding the, or making the target audience aware of that how changing, how the standards of translation are changing, have changed rather over time in terms of depicting the specific ideologies, and like if there is a kind of a feminist writing or any other changes which are taking place in terms of academia, in terms of research, in terms of writing standards, whatever is happening is. So somehow he says that these people who are translating, and Pesnat and Leffer in particular in this book, they bring up case studies, जो actual translated translations हैं in target text में. They bring forth and make a kind of a comparison between source language to target language and text and to target text in terms of that how over the time different ideologies, ways of thinking, different mindsets and different approaches, different movements in literary movements. Like there are times when we talk about that feminism is one literary movement, classicism used to be in the older times, then you have romanticism, then you have what structuralism, then you have what is modernism, postmodernist theory, you have post-colonial, ये सारी different literary movements see, which are taking place in literature. So the text which they have selected is in terms of, they kind of depict these different ideologies which were reflected in these writings, feminist writings in particular, that what type of issues are being brought by feminist writing, what are the ideologies represented in source text and how they are translated into target text, and so on. And it also meant that translation as an appropriation. So probably you're not familiar with the word appropriation. Appropriation here, it implies that this is like a deliberate reworking of images and styles from earlier well-known works of art. So the classics and earlier well-known works of art which were actually written, how the target audience, how the writers, the translators, when they're translating it into the target language, they would become more like rewriters जो उनको transform करके उनको change करके पेश कर रहे हैं. And so much so that they're taking this liberty of appropriation. By appropriation means कि वो deliberately they are reworking, changing any images and styles which were part and parcel of the earlier works of art, literary writings, जो उनका एक style था जो reflect होता था in that work, they are deliberately being changed by the translators. And this is what the word appropriation stands for. कि उन्होंने, they have done it deliberately, changing the style and images which were part of the earlier writings, classical writings or other writings from different genres or different time periods. They translate it and they change it, and then they take this liberty on themselves that they have this been given this freedom. उनको ये license है कि वो ऐसे changes कर सकें. So they appropriate and then they bring it into translated version. And so much so other factors also like colonization and others. And this also means that it would not only here, it would also mean like film rewrites that some people who are writing or who are, actually a kitab hai, just I gave you the example of, Mohsin Hamid's Reluctant Fundamentalist, and when say somebody, it has been made into a movie in India. So it is said that how the producers of that film, they take upon them this liberty that they can appropriate. That means कि उनके पास एक license है, उसको modify कर सकते हैं, उसको change कर सकते हैं, images, reworking, change it. This is actually what happens very frequently because this is a very common practice that these good books which are very popular, they are picked up by film producers for making, their movies on that. So sometimes some of the writers, some of the film producers are very, they stay very close to the actual source language, source text, source story को. The others, they take this liberty that they can, they as film writers, they can rewrite, they can change, they can appropriate, उसको change करके और ऐसा present करेंगे which would be feasible, which would be acceptable to their own target or the target language audience. If it's a movie in English language, तो वो कहेंगे ऐसी मूवी हॉलीवुड प्रेजेंट करे, इवन अ टेक्स्ट इज टेकन फ्रॉम से फ्रॉम इंडिया, written in Hindi or Pakistani text and from South America, उसको ऐसे transform appropriate करेंगे in English language in terms of culture as well, that it is acceptable by the target audience. Okay, so this is what it means that culture became a very very important factor for these translators. So the following three major areas where cultural studies have influenced translation studies during the 1990s, they will be discussed in detail. So what I'm going to do is that we're just going to focus upon these aspects, although this is a full-fledged chapter 8 of your books by by this is your source book by Jeremy Monday. So but they basically believe it is that these three aspects are very important: the translation as a rewriting, translation and gender, it is, I'm sorry, translation and gender, and third is translation as post-colonialism. So we are going to look at each of these one by one and see that what this, these writers, what did, I mean, Jeremy, how he's going to present and how he's going to talk about how these issues are discussed here. Okay. So let me read a little bit from this, a little bit of detail. I already explained about examples of what these was: appropriation, translation, colonization, translation as rewriting, including film rewrites and all that. So now we are going to move on and see that what did translation as rewriting meant, because this is, we are going to talk in terms of Andre Lefere's work in particular, that wow, how Andre talked in particular about this first issue, the translation as rewriting, or what did it stand for, or what was the significance. So Andre Lefere's work in translation studies basically developed out of his strong links with the polysystem theory, though his later work on translation and culture in many ways presents a bridging point to the cultural turn. This is presented in his book Translation, Rewriting, and the Manipulation of Literary Fame. So, in particular, Andre Lefevere, let me explain to you a little bit about the background of who Andre Lefevere was. Basically, his contribution was more in terms of comparative literature department. He worked initially in Belgium and then in USA at the University of Texas at Austin. Remember, I told you that most of these, how actually translation studies emerged initially in USA, in the first or second or third lectures. In USA terms, what's comparative literature, and if you try to recollect, it was contrastive analysis in terms of language of the two texts compared, and comparative literature was how, in terms of translation, how it emerged in terms of comparing between two literatures. So Andre Lefere's works, in particular, his background was such that he worked in the comparative literature department initially in Belgium, and then he moved to USA, and he worked at the University of Texas, Austin. And his work in translation studies basically developed out of his very, very strong links with this particular poly system of theory, which we are going to move on in the next class or so. Then I'm going to explain to you in detail what it implies. So, although some may argue that Lefevere sits more closely, some people feel that his contribution is more to the system theorist, that means polysystem system. But it is felt that his later work on translation and culture, of which he basically talks about in his famous book, Translation, Rewriting, and the Manipulation of Literary Form. So, in this particular book, which was published in 1992, In this particular book, his whole thrust is upon translation as rewriting and manipulation of literary form, and somehow he worked towards, in particular, in bridging the gap in translation from source language to target language, and in particular in terms the word, how to come closer in terms of the term, cultural term, that how, you know, true the translators are in terms of translating from source text to target text, in terms of particular the culture, how they present the culture in the target language. Okay, so although his work was in the polysystems theory as well, but he got his in this particular book. He focuses more on cultural turn and more in terms of rewriting, translation as rewriting, and in particular how culture is reflected target in the target language and in the target text. Lefevere focuses on the examination of the very concrete factors that govern the reception, acceptance, or rejection of literary text. That is, issues such as power, ideology, institution, and manipulation. So basically, his focus was on this was that how examining a very concrete, close examination in terms of having a look at the reception means that how anything which is translated into the target language, how it is received on the receiving end, the reception, the receiving audience, जिनके लिए translate की जा रही है, how it is accepted in terms of reception, how is it accepted or rejected, and if it is in terms of if its source text is translated into target text, this is a very important factor that how well it is received on the receiving end, that is the target audience, if it's a literary text, a novel or a short story or fiction, and also if it's not accepted, if it is rejected, then what's the reason. And here comes the play upon very important issues which are known as power, ideology, institution, and manipulation. That how these very key important issues such as power and ideology and institution and manipulation play an important role in this translation. So what he did was in terms of he focused more on this aspect, that how people involved in particular in power positions, who are involved actually in the translation process. So for Lefevere, who are these people who are involved or who are based in the power positions, or who are the ones or those? So he talks about that for him as translation is like rewriting literature and governing its consumption by the general public. That whatever literature is in the source text, it is when you're translating it into the target length, it's almost like you're rewriting it. उसको आप इतना change कर रहे हैं. It's like you rewriting, and then you're keeping in mind your general public, the target audience, the target readers as well. So the motivation for such rewriting can be ideological. You see that after all, any person who is as a rewriter who is translating any source text, उसके लिए क्या motivation होगी? What because this is one step ahead of translation. Your focus is not on exactly word for word, sense for sense translation as the earlier linguistic approaches were, in which the focus was on the linguistic aspect, language, and vocabulary and others. Here we are talking about rewriting. जब आप किसी चीज को rewrite करते हैं, that means you're given this license, this freedom, कि आप उसको change करके, modify करके, appropriate करके, you can present it something in such a way as it is palatable, which is acceptable by the target audience, and then it obviously entails a person who's a rewriter. It's more hard work because आपको इस तरह present करनी है आपकी translation version, which should be acceptable to your target audience. So the motivation for such rewriting, such rewriters or translators, there would be two motivations. Why they are, after all, what is the big deal? Why they are changing so much, appropriating the source text? There are two reasons. One thing is it could be ideological. By ideological, it means that either they are conforming to or they are against the dominant ideology that means they have to change this, the rewriting and rewriting source text को ऐसा change कर लेंगे because they have to present it, जो dominant ideology है of the target text में जैसे उनको acceptable होगा, आपको वैसी चीज़ present करनी है जो target audience को चाहिए. So you are doing it, that would be one way or one reason for doing it, or simple ways that maybe you just simply rebel against it. You do not agree with the source text writer. जो कुछ भी उसने लिख दिया, अब इट्स नॉट नेसेसरली इसमें आप उसको लिटरेरी राइटिंग्स कहेंगे, नॉन लिटरेरी राइटिंग्स हो सकते हैं, लेक्चर्स हो सकते हैं, you know, other pieces of writings हो सकती हैं. So either the rewriter or the translator simply rebels, is simply is against whatever is written by in the source text. तो वो जब उसको ट्रांसलेट कर रहा है अपने ऑडियंस के लिए, तो वो उसको ऐसे चेंज करेगा which is according to his way of thinking, and which is acceptable to the dominant ideology, to the dominant culture, to the people who would be the beneficiaries of this. So एक उसकी motivation ये हो सकती है, one motivation for as a rewriter why this so much of change is being brought into the source text. Or the second would be poetological. Poetological. The word poetological is taken actually from the word poetics. Now you must be wondering that what is poetics? Actually, poetics is a literary term, and poetics basically implies that it's a formal system of study of poetry, taken from the root word poetry. That poetological, that means it's a very, very formal system. It's a formal study of poetry. It's a very formal system in which you study poetry. Or it could also mean that it's like a literary criticism that deals with the nature and the laws of poetry, that how poetry is written, what are the underlying rules, what is the formal system, what's the study of poetry. So a translator or a rewriter in this capacity would be said is translating, say, literary text है या poems को translate कर रहा है, उसके लिए pertinent example ये हो सकता है कि he is again rebelling against the initial source writer or poet जिसने कि वो actual poem लिखी थी, poetry लिखी थी, उससे वो agree नहीं करता, is not and doesn't want to conform. Either he would just conform, is not conforming, or he is rebelling against the dominant preferred poetics. In both cases, this would entail that these two would be the dominant reasons for motivation for a person who is rewriting, translating, in terms of with this aspect in mind कि आपने इतना transform करना है translation को, उसको it's almost like you're rewriting it because you're making it acceptable in your target audience, target readers के लिए. Okay, so there are two reasons: either ideological reason, you don't agree with the ideology which is presented by the source writer, और आपको ऐसे present कर रहे हैं आप rebel करके कि ताकि acceptable हो, ताकि या आप अगर poetry को literature को translate कर रहे हो तो आप disagree करते हो with should I say the systematic, it's a systematic study of poetry. You as a critic to deal with the nature and how laws of poetry, how it has been presented by the source writer, और कैसे आपको उसको translate करते हो. So here a very, very pertinent example which I'm going to share is of Edward Fitzgerald. He's a very famous 19th century translator or rewriter. You can say that Edward Fitzgerald, a very prominent, a very important, translator of, should I say, of 19th century. And his main contribution is in terms of he translated a very famous poet, Persian poet, Umar Khayyam. You're all famous with Umar Khayyam's Rubaiyat, and he's a very well-known Persian poet. And when actually Edward Fitzgerald decided to translate Omar Khayyam's poetry into English, so what he talked about is, again, with a very, very Western sort of a mindset, with having this feeling that, the West is superior, they have a superior culture. Because you see, sometimes this also becomes an issue when something is being translated from something from the Orient, that means from the East, is being translated in the West. So here comes a very important notion or a mindset of the translator. If the translator happens to be somebody from the West, तो उसके mind में एक ingrained superiority complex, and they would see that, okay, say this poem is coming from Persia. Persia, according to them, they felt it should is much inferior in culture in terms of the West, in terms of Europe. So, without any as authority or something, the translator, in this particular, Fitzgerald took upon himself this license that he can change and he can take liberties in the translation in order to improve. He felt that, not knowing that Omar Khayyam as a poet has its own stature. He was a classic poet, a classic Persian poet. So if a classic poet of a stature of Omar Khayyam's poetry is being translated into English language, that doesn't give this Fitzgerald any license कि वो ये सोचे कि Persians are inferior. तो अब उनको जब translate कर रहे हैं English language में, तो he can take the liberty to translate it. And according to him, he felt that when he's translating it, he can improve on the original as well. That means he taking one step ahead. It's not simple word for word translation or linguistic translation. He gets on himself this liberty कि उसको एक license मिल गया कि वो तो उसको improve कर सकता है. So improve means that he can appropriate, he can change. So in order to improve on the original, and at the same time making it conform to the expected Western literary conventions. He said that as a Western translator, if he's translating this text, that means he's taking this liberty on himself that he can translate it and then translate it in such a manner or improve it or change it, the source structure in such a manner that the Western literary audience would accept it. Because for him, obviously, as a translator, what was most important was is that for all the effort which he would take in terms of translating from Persian into English, his book, his translation should be a success story. It should be acceptable in the literary circles of the West, and that would only be done if it is accepted by the Western literary conventions as well. In terms of they feel that, okay, whatever the text, if it was according to the West, if they felt that it's coming from a comparatively inferior culture, Persian, for them, Persians itself, and they said that if it's being translated, this poetry, into English language, it should at least conform to the expected Western literary conventions according to which it would be acceptable to them. Okay, so this is what is he's talking about, and he's giving this particular example. So Lefevere, I'm just going to take one paragraph, and then I'm going to stop for today. So Lefevere basically explains that the same basic process of rewriting is at work in translation, historiography, anthologization, criticism, editing. So in particular, Lefevere talks about this is that he, as a neutral sort of person, is bringing forth. He says that this process, this trend, I should say, which of rewriting, which was at work in case of people like Edward Fitzgerald, same sort of approach was not followed. It was followed by other people as well who were kind of translating, or they were saying that they are rewriting it. And for them, it was either in terms of other non-literary writings as well. A very important aspect of non-literary writing is historiography. The word historiography, maybe you're not familiar, is related to the word history. We're all familiar with what history is. History is based on facts, okay? So in itself, it's very common practice is that when anything belonging to the Orient, anything belonging to the East, when it is translated, even in terms of lit history as well, a very common fact is that somebody wants to join that, say, history of the subcontinent. You know that the Indian subcontinent was colonized by the British. So much so, it is said that even somebody in the West who were to talk about even the very simple historical facts about the process of translation of the subcontinent, when they are translating it, वो कुछ अपने aspect से लिखेंगे. Because say the history of colonization in the subcontinent, उसको दो versions हो सकते हैं. एक तो version होगा the people who were colonized, the Indian Muslims and the Hindus who were the locals, who were the natives of the subcontinent. They would be writing history of subcontinent during the colonial times from their own perspective. from what they feel. Any book written about history in India at that time, and if they were to talk about the British who came to the subcontinent and colonized, वो एक अपने perspective से history लिखेंगे. But say such a book which is written about the history of subcontinent, maybe it's written in Hindi or Urdu, and when it is translated in the West, say by a British writer, when that a British translator or rewriter would be translating it or rewriting is the most appropriate. You know what they would be doing? It would not be the history as it is, the version which was actually given by the natives of the subcontinent. What this person is going to rewrite is going to bring a perspective of the West, the British, who came here as the colonial masters. So even non-literary texts also tend, they are also kind of rewritten by the rewriters. वो history को भी modify कर देते हैं from their own perspective. They change it. Okay, so much say in terms of rewriting, not only as I said works in literary writing, it works in historiography, it works of anthology when you're talking about compiling different works of art, criticism and editing and so on. So this translation, so this bringing together of studies of original writings and translation shows translation being incorporated into the generic literary criticism. However, it is translation that is central. So what actually Lefevere in his book is doing a great service in terms of he's bringing this discrepancy, in terms of bringing forth for the readers that they kya approach chal rahi hai, what approach is being carried on in the West as rewriters, that how they tend to even change, play with the history, trying it modified, okay, and how changing from original writings and in translators, how they incorporated changes and all that, okay. So I will quote one last quote from Levere's book and I'll read. So, according to him, translation is the most obviously recognizable type of rewriting, and it is potentially the most influential because it is able to project the image of an author and of those works beyond the boundaries of their culture of origin. Okay. So with this, I'm going. This is I've come to the end of today's lecture. So I hope it's everything is clear to you in terms of the role of culture, how it is presented, how it has to be carried on, in particular, in terms of cultural issues,